a movie that was heavily criticized after its release. It brought together Orlando Bloom, Eva Green, Edward Norton, and a host of other big names. It is also a movie that gained immense popularity after the director's cut version was released, receiving widespread acclaim. The reason behind it was that a God-level film editor cut nearly 50 minutes from the original film, which destroyed the movie's coherence, ruined the plot, and led to a sharp decline in its reputation. It wasn't until 2007 that the director personally took charge and completed the version he was most satisfied with. This is the top-tier historical war film, Kingdom of Heaven. It depicts the tumultuous history of the Crusades in medieval Europe. By the late 12th century, Jerusalem had been under the occupation of the Christian military forces for almost 100 years. However, the feudal rule in Europe during that time was brutal, causing great suffering among both nobles and commoners. They all longed to escape to the Holy Land in search of wealth or redemption. One day, in a small village in rural France, as snowflakes danced in the air, a massive crucifix on a hillside stood out, even obscuring the fading rays of the setting sun. A knight returned to his homeland, searching for his son. The knight's name was Godfrey, a baron who had his own domain in Jerusalem. His son, Balian, was a blacksmith in Milan, consumed by the agony of losing his wife and child. Their son died shortly after birth, and his wife, overwhelmed with grief, took her own life. Godfrey finds him and reveals the truth about the past. It turns out that when he was younger, he forced Balian's mother to, hoping to take Balian to Jerusalem to inherit his own title and seeking Balian's forgiveness. In his grief, Balian rejected his proposal. At night, Balian was approached by his half-brother, who had malicious intentions. He persuaded Balian to go to Jerusalem and constantly provoked him. It turned out that his half-brother had always coveted Balian's sole possession and, after Balian's wife's death, decapitated her because suicide was against Christian teachings and meant one could not enter heaven but would go to hell. It so happened that Balian saw him with his wife's cross, killed his half-brother and retrieved his wife's crucifix. He then set his blacksmith shop on fire and rode after Godfrey and his companions, expressing his willingness to go to the holy city of Jerusalem, hoping to cleanse himself and his wife of their sins. This could also be seen as a genuine recognition and acknowledgement of their father-son relationship. During their rest, Godfrey took the opportunity to teach Balian swordsmanship. Just as they were engaged in sparring, a cold arrow strikes the attendant was killed straight away. Soon after, Godfrey's nephew appeared, seemingly to capture Balian but actually intending to kill both Balian and his father. According to the traditions of that time, Balian could also inherit Godfrey's title. Both sides immediately engaged in a fierce battle, and their opponents were completely annihilated. However, Godfrey himself suffered severe injuries. An arrow penetrates the bone marrow. The wound is serious. In those days, such wounds were left to fate. Unfortunately, luck was not on his side. Eventually, Godfrey fell. In his final moments, he passed on the title and the great sword to Balian, officially appointing him as a knight. He admonished Balian to uphold the chivalrous code and fulfill the knight's oath. In the darkness of the sea, the waves are rough and several sailing boats are bobbing in the storm. Balian is huddled in a corner alone in the lightning and thunder. Turned out that the bearded knight had other matters to attend to and couldn't accompany Balian to Jerusalem. After explaining the situation, Balian embarked on his journey alone. However, the pilgrimage path was destined to be filled with hardships. As expected, they encountered a storm during the voyage, and Balian was the only one who managed to escape. He brought along a horse and resumed his pilgrimage. On the way, he encountered two Saracen men. Through the translation of a dark-clad servant, Balian learned that the splendidly dressed Saracen claimed the horse as his own because this is his territory. Forced into a corner, Balian could only resolve the issue through a duel. In the end, Balian emerged victorious, defeating the Saracen and subduing the dark-clad servant, compelling him to lead the way to the holy city of Jerusalem. After several days of toil, the two finally arrived outside the city. Upon entering the city, Balian not only set the dark-clad servant free but also gave him his own horse. He then proceeded to the burial place of Jesus, where he prayed for his wife, seeking redemption for both her and himself. He also buried his wife's belongings at that location. In the bustling marketplace, Balian was recognized by his subordinates through his sword and was brought to the baron's mansion. He inherited everything there. Before long, King Baldwin IV summoned Balian. At this time, Baldwin IV was afflicted with leprosy and nearing the end of his life. After a conversation, Baldwin IV held Balian in high regard and agreed to let him inherit his father's estate in Ibelin. With the arrival of Balian, the long-abandoned fiefdom finally found its owner and gradually came back to life. During this period, Balian coincidentally met Princess Sibylla of the kingdom. Although she had experienced a failed marriage, Sibylla had already placed her trust in and secretly approved of Balian. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was facing turmoil. Baldwin IV advocated for peaceful coexistence with the Muslims, and he possessed extraordinary wisdom and strategy. However, he was also tormented by illness, only barely able to maintain the status quo. The Templar Knights, led by Guy, held the greatest influence within the kingdom. Under Rainald's instigation, they plundered Arab caravans, giving Saladin, the ruler of the Ayyubid dynasty, a pretext to launch an invasion. The Muslim army, vast and formidable, marched towards Jerusalem. Balian's fiefdom was the first to be attacked. With only a few dozen knights at his side, Balian fearlessly confronted the overwhelmingly larger Muslim forces. Without hesitation, they charged head-on, fulfilling their knightly oath. In the face of a powerful enemy, they remained undaunted, fighting to protect the weak and to buy more time for the people to escape. Clearly, this was an uneven battle with an obvious outcome. However, when Balian and his comrades were captured, they were not executed. It turned out that the enemy commander was the same dark-clad servant whom Balian had spared earlier. Just then, in the distance, clouds of dust arose, and the sky was obscured by countless banners. A massive cross shimmered with golden light. King Baldwin IV personally led a large army to provide reinforcement, facing the countless Crusaders. Even Saladin had no choice but to retreat. After entering the city, Baldwin severely punished the mastermind behind the looting, Rainald. However, plagued by his prolonged illness, he also collapsed to the ground, with his condition worsening and on his deathbed. Considering Balian's previous brave acts, Baldwin planned to betroth the princess to him. He also intended to pass the military authority to Balian, hoping that he would assist the new king in governing Jerusalem. However, this would require eliminating Guy and his followers who had a betrothal with the princess. Out of their commitment and loyalty to the knight's oath, Balian were unwilling to witness more bloodshed and turmoil. Balian politely declined Baldwin. Sibylla learned of Balian's decision and questioned him with great confusion. In the midst of the turmoil that Jerusalem was facing, what they needed was not the perfect knightly spirit. For Balian, Jerusalem was the land of loving kindness, where he placed his desire for redemption and the purest ideals of loving kindness. His faith was intimately connected to this land, the last place where his soul could find solace. If he violated it here, his soul would have nowhere to go. However, ruling the kingdom required the support of the Templar Knights. Helpless, Sibylla had no choice but to marry Guy. Meanwhile, King Baldwin's health deteriorated, and as he looked at his sister who came to visit, he spoke his final words. Baldwin IV eventually passed away. In history, Baldwin, at the age of 16, led a few hundred cavalry and 3,000 infantry to defeat Saladin's army of 30,000. However, eventually died of leprosy and died at the young age of 24. Perhaps it was a relief for him too. Soon, Sibylla's son was crowned king, with Sibylla herself acting as regent behind the scenes. While assisting her son in signing documents, Sibylla noticed that her son's hands were unresponsive to the scorching hot wax. Even when the doctor pricked his feet with a needle, he felt nothing. Finally, Sibylla realized that her son had also contracted leprosy. Reflecting on her brother's years of suffering, with his body decaying and relying on a mask to survive each day, she couldn't bear the thought of her son meeting the same fate. She chose to end his suffering with poison, making the painful decision that perhaps only a mother could understand. Meanwhile, Sibylla's fiancé, Guy, naturally ascended to the throne of Jerusalem. The arrogant and self-centered Guy promptly released his accomplice, Rainald. As he had always desired another crusade, he needed Rainald to stir up conflicts and provoke war against the Muslims. Rainald, a veteran, immediately slaughtered an Arab village. This included Saladin's own sister among the victims. Saladin was truly furious this time. Out of courtesy, he first sent an envoy to demand that Guy surrender the murderer, return his sister's body, and voluntarily withdraw from the city of Jerusalem. However, the arrogant Guy directly killed the envoy. He immediately gathered his army and marched towards Saladin's distant camp. At this moment, Balian advised Guy to reconsider the current situation and advocated for defending Jerusalem as the wisest choice. But the disdainful Guy ignored Balian's advice and personally led his knights in a grand departure. Amidst the vast desert and scorching sun, with no logistical support or water supply, knights falls to the ground one after another on the march. On the other hand, Saladin's army waited comfortably, their morale soaring. At this moment the sentries also spotted the Crusader. In the distance, all this is the will of God. The outcome of the battle was evident. The fallen crosses no longer gleamed with golden light, indicating the defeat of the Crusaders. Guy was captured by Saladin but not killed. Saladin merely taunted him, saying that one king doesn't kill another. Sensing the precarious situation, Balian approached to gather intelligence on the enemy. What he saw was a vast number of vultures darkening the sky and countless corpses littering the land. Everyone was shocked and horrified by the devastating scene before them. Tiberius has also lost faith in Jerusalem. He and his group of knights have departed for Cyprus. However, Jerusalem still harbors hundreds of thousands of elderly, weak, and vulnerable inhabitants. Balian, who has always adhered to the Knight's Code, cannot abandon them to be slaughtered on the day the city falls. While Balian is making defensive preparations, Saladin's army of 200,000 soldiers approaches Jerusalem in a formidable manner. Utilizing his title as a baron, Balian rallies the few remaining soldiers to defend the city. The only way to survive now is to fight to the death. The bishop, standing nearby, becomes anxious and questions how they can defend the city without knights. Balian, using his noble status, he declares that anyone capable of wielding a weapon, regardless of their background, whether they are servants or lowly gravediggers, shall be knighted from that moment on. After the ennoblement ceremony, Balian slaps a servant, just as his father had done when he was knighted. This act symbolizes the continuation of the knightly spirit. That night, rows of fires illuminate the city's outskirts as Saladin launches his attack. He orders catapults to relentlessly bombard the city walls in an attempt to breach them. Burning projectiles rain down from the sky, turning the city into a sea of flames. Balian directs the crowd to put out the fire. By virtue of the walls of Jerusalem, with great difficulty, they survived the first day's assault. With the vibrant energy of the morning sun, the densely packed army of Saladin stood before the holy city, offering prayers. Soon, they brought forward a man, who turned out to be Guy. Before launching the siege, Guy had stripped him naked, put a hat on his head, and made him ride a donkey, subjecting him to humiliation. The soldiers, in a black mass, pushed forward the siege machinery, and the siege battle erupted. The Muslim army advanced steadily and orderly, passing through the white defensive markers. Upon reaching these markers, Balian ordered the catapults within the city to counterattack. It turned out that the city had limited ammunition and could only engage when the enemy came within range. This ensured the precise targeting of the catapults, striking Saladin's forces accurately. Subsequently, relying on the defensive markers, they aimed to deplete Saladin's army. However, it could only be a battle of attrition. Soon enough, the siege engines reached the base of the city walls, and a brutal attack and defense battle began. The Saladin army below was vast, like a sea of soldiers, while the defenders on the city walls fought desperately. Balian, commanding the defense, continuously resolved crises in precarious situations. As the day progressed, time gradually passed. Saladin did not gain an advantage in the first day of the attack. Both sides suffered heavy losses. However, the attack on the second day was even more fierce. Saladin deployed all of his siege towers. The city walls were nearly breached. The siege tower that was eventually attacked with a giant javelin to turn the tide of battle. One after another, the attacked siege towers toppled over, surprising Saladin, who was observing from afar. The complete destruction of the siege towers resulted in the utter failure of the second assault. The relentless fighting continued for 2 days, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The bodies piled up like mountains. At this point, Saladin received news that the old city walls of Jerusalem were relatively weak, and they could exploit this vulnerability by using catapults to create a breach. Balian inside the city was well aware of this and sensed that this would be the decisive point in the defense. As expected, on the third day, Saladin ordered a concentrated bombardment on the old city walls. In an instant, the walls collapsed with a thunderous crash, and both sides quickly rushed towards the breach, engaging in close combat. Although Saladin had the numerical advantage, the breach was too narrow, and they struggled to break through. After a day of intense close combat, the breach was filled with countless bodies. Perhaps the cost of death and injury was too high because Saladin ultimately chose to negotiate. Balian takes a hardline, says he wants to live and die with Jerusalem. Saladin's goal was the holy city, and he promised to let all the people within the city go free. And that's what Balian has been fighting for. Seeing Saladin relenting, Balian immediately agreed to surrender the city. War is cruel, and ultimately, peace is achieved through hard-fought battles. Saladin also fulfilled his promise, releasing all the people and soldiers within the city. The city's inhabitants quickly evacuated. Amidst the crowd, Balian found Sibylla, the princess. At that moment, appeared slightly disheveled. In the end, Balian and Sibylla returned to a small village in France. 2 years later, the Third Crusade began. A crowned figure approached Balian, who turned out to be the renowned King Richard the Lionheart. King Richard the Lionheart himself led his army, intending to capture Jerusalem. He earnestly requested Balian to join him once again and lend his assistance. However, Balian humbly said that he was only a blacksmith and politely declined the Lionheart's request, for at this time he has completed the redemption of himself. In the distance, amidst swirling dust, a grand army suddenly emerged like a mirage from the horizon. The gleaming crosses, the banners that overshadow the sky, the dense Christian army. The scene recalls a classic moment from the film Kingdom of Heaven. A knightly army encircled a king wearing a silver mask and adorned in splendid attire. This king was none other than the famous leper king, Baldwin IV. Among the film's most stunning scenes was the one where he, alone and mounted on a horse, appeared before Saladin for negotiations. The leper king, a formidable opponent that Saladin could never surpass. The last strong man of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he was both the strongest and the most fragile ruler. A noble king,